The death was ruled an accidental fall. The physical findings were inconsistent with that determination. Upon initial examination, the cause of death was listed as multiple fractures and internal injuries sustained in a fall from height. However, upon closer inspection, a fracture of the skull base emerged as the central finding. This type of injury is typically associated with significant force, often indicative of an impact consistent with high-velocity trauma rather than a simple fall. The presence of this specific fracture prompted a reevaluation of the circumstances leading to the deceased's demise. A detailed forensic autopsy and subsequent analysis revealed additional evidence that contradicted the initial assessment of accidental death, suggesting alternative mechanisms of injury. This case underscores the critical importance of thorough investigation in determining the true cause of such fatal incidents. Chapter: Case background. The incident under review occurred on a residential street in suburban Cleveland on October 15 at approximately 4:30 p.m. local time. A passerby, MS, reported discovering an individual lying motionless on the ground near a steep flight of concrete steps leading up to a house. Initially observed was a middle-aged adult positioned face down with no visible signs of external trauma aside from minor abrasions around the knees and elbows. MS assumed the person had experienced a sudden medical episode, possibly a seizure or syncope, due to the absence of obvious injuries indicative of assault or collision with vehicles. Upon closer inspection, bystanders noticed that the individual was not responsive to verbal stimuli, nor did they exhibit any signs of voluntary movement. Emergency services were immediately contacted and arrived within minutes to assess the situation. Chapter: Initial findings upon arrival at the scene. First responders noted the deceased lying supine on the ground adjacent to a second-story balcony railing. The immediate environment was characterized by a pristine condition, devoid of any visible foreign objects or signs of struggle. Preliminary observations indicated no external bleeding or obvious wounds, except for minor abrasions consistent with an impact event. Initial medical assessment revealed no palpable fractures, but reported diminished consciousness and altered mental status indicative of possible intracranial injury. The body position suggested a fall from height, corroborated by the proximity to the balcony edge. Given these circumstances, further investigation was warranted due to incongruities between external injuries and clinical presentation, necessitating transport for radiological examination, where subsequent imaging confirmed a fracture of the skull base. The body position suggested a fall from height, corroborated by the proximity to the balcony edge. This finding prompted reclassification of the manner of death as undetermined pending additional forensic analysis. Chapter: Forensic investigation at the scene. Investigators meticulously documented and collected all relevant evidence pertinent to a fall resulting in a fracture of the skull base. Physical evidence included debris from the impact surface, such as carpet fibers and paint chips, which were carefully bagged for further analysis. Notable was the absence of any sharp or heavy objects that could have caused an additional traumatic injury, suggesting the fall occurred under ordinary circumstances without external assistance. The deceased's personal effects were secured in a separate evidence locker to maintain chain of custody. Forensic photographs captured detailed images of the impact site and the surrounding area, providing critical visual documentation for subsequent analysis. All collected items were logged with unique identifiers and transferred to the forensic laboratory for further examination, ensuring no contamination or loss during transit. The laboratory analysis involved comprehensive testing to determine the extent of acceleration due to the fall and its impact on the deceased's cranial anatomy. Radiological scans, including computed tomography, CT, and magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, were utilized to assess bone fractures and intracranial hemorrhages. Microscopic examination of tissue samples revealed disrupted collagen fibers and increased hemosiderin deposition indicative of recent bleeding. Histology confirmed the presence of acute traumatic brain injury, with evidence of neuronal cell death, in both gray and white matter regions. Biochemical assays for markers such as S100B and glial fibrillary acidic protein, GFAP, were conducted to quantify intracranial trauma, yielding elevated concentrations consistent with severe impact force. These findings collectively support the central hypothesis of significant acceleration during the fall, leading to a fracture of the skull base and subsequent cerebral injuries. The examination of the deceased revealed a fracture of the skull base consistent with an acceleration due to fall from height. Forensic evidence, including witness statements and environmental analysis, indicated a single event sequence. Impact marks on the ground corroborated the height estimation, placing the point of origin at approximately 15 meters above the landing site. Radiological imaging confirmed no pre-existing conditions that would have contributed to the fracture, supporting the conclusion that the injury was sustained during the fall. The postmortem interval was determined through analysis of gastric contents and entomology, suggesting a timeframe consistent with the reported last seen location. This timeline established an exact sequence. The deceased fell from the specified height at approximately 1,800 hours on the day in question, ruling out alternative scenarios such as a fall from lesser heights or pre-existing trauma. The forensic analysis of the deceased revealed a complex pattern of injuries consistent with an acceleration-deceleration mechanism, specifically involving a fall from height. The fracture of the skull base, located at the petrous portion of the temporal bone and extending into the posterior cranial fossa, indicates significant force imparted to the head upon impact. This finding is corroborated by radiographic evidence demonstrating comminuted fractures, consistent with blunt trauma rather than accidental falls of lesser magnitude. While the height from which the deceased fell cannot be definitively quantified based on current forensic data alone, the severity and location of the fracture suggest a fall from at least a second-story elevation. The presence of bilateral rib fractures further supports a high-impact event. Under oath, an expert would assert that these injuries are indicative of a fatal fall from significant height, with contributing factors possibly including loss of consciousness or impaired judgment prior to the incident. Chapter Resolution. The final determination in this case is that the deceased sustained a fracture of the skull base as a result of an accelerated fall. Initial findings suggested a more gradual descent, based on the absence of widespread comminuted fractures and the limited abrasions noted on the skin surface. However, further analysis revealed significant vertical displacement during the latter stages of the fall, indicated by the presence of high-impact linear fractures in the posterior cranial fossa. CT scans and radiographic imaging confirmed the acceleration due to the fall, with clear evidence of sudden deceleration at impact, as evidenced by the comminuted nature of these particular fractures. This aligns with expert opinions that such injuries are characteristic of a rapidly accelerated descent, followed by abrupt termination upon contact with the ground or other surface. The central finding was established through meticulous examination of both macroscopic and microscopic pathology, corroborated by biomechanical modeling, which simulated the forces likely experienced during the fall. These findings shifted our understanding from an assumption of a slow, controlled descent to one involving significant vertical acceleration, thus altering the initial assessment of the mechanism of injury. This case underscores the importance of meticulous examination in determining fall dynamics through fracture patterns and acceleration forces. Detailed documentation of trauma distribution aids in distinguishing between accidental falls and other causative factors, enhancing forensic accuracy. The file remains open.